Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. A lot of people might tell you what they use to feed their orchids with, and possibly even how strong a mix they use in whatever parts per million, but they might not tell you why they're using it. Sometimes it's because somebody said they should, and that includes me. I don't profess to understand all of this. I'm getting there, but there'll always be something I don't know. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, this is my arsenal, I'll call it. As far as I'm concerned, these two little gadgets are essentials, and I wouldn't embark on this without these. I just wouldn't. I like to know what my orchids are getting, not only in the content of this, but how strong things are and stuff like that. As soon as you start playing with different chemicals and fertilizers and additives, it's good to know how much of these you're putting in, or you can generate imbalances. And some of the elements in fertilizers can be stonked up without too much adverse effect, but some can have a dramatic, I'll call it an anti-effect. Things like magnesium, it's got to be there, don't get me wrong, and sometimes a little bit of an extra kick can do your plants the world of good, but you can overdose that stuff, and if it becomes dominant, it becomes what's called antagonistic, and it will stop some of the other elements working and lock them out. So by boosting one, you could be ruining the effect of some others. So in all cases, caution. Go steady. And that's why I want that TDS meter, so that I know what I'm adding in there and nothing's going over the top. Right, when you start playing with additives and things like that, your pH is going to go up and down like a flipping yo-yo. And sometimes it will need adjusting, even just with your normal fertiliser, depending on how much fertiliser you put in. When you add fertiliser, generally speaking, your pH will drop. So if you're starting with water that's already quite a low pH, adding your fertiliser could drop it beyond the recommended levels. But anyway, to play with pH, I use citric acid to take my pH down. Yeah, and I bought that as crystals that will probably last about 200 years, I suspect, for about £2 on eBay. And I just put a small amount in with some RO water, give it a good shake, and keep it as a stock solution. On occasions, no names mentioned, yeah, the pH can rocket upwards and get well alkaline. So basically, bicarbonate of soda will raise the pH, but it will raise it dramatically. I had about 3 litres of water mixed up, and basically I just got the end of my finger wet, damp I'll say, touched that bicarbonate of soda. I had the merest sprinkle of that powder on the end of my finger, and I mixed that in with my what I was using at the time, and it raised the pH from somewhere around 5.9 to 8.5. Just a spot on the end of my finger. So watch that stuff. It has a dramatic effect. Doesn't do the plants any harm. Neither of those two will hurt the plants. I wouldn't recommend watering them with it, but Right. My general purpose feed, I don't use anything else. This is the only one I use. It's got everything in it that I need in reasonable proportions for a general feed. But there are times when I want to change that. Well, obviously I don't want loads of different fertilizers, so that's what that lot comes in for. This is a reasonable mix. The MSU formula, the experiments were done analysing the contents of plants, changing the mixes to see what effect it had. And the one effect that was surprising even to the people doing the experiment was the fact that the orchids were not using anywhere near as much phosphorus as once was thought. because many of the fertilisers are things like 20-20-20. So the proportion of the phosphorus is around the same as the nitrogen and the potassium. And it was deemed by these good people doing some hard work for us that it was not necessary to have that phosphorus value so high. So they reduced it down to the point where it was getting used, and that's where they ended up. So that's got mainly nitrate nitrogen, which is readily absorbed. It's got a low phosphorus, so that was 13% nitrogen, blah, blah, come on mouth. 3% phosphorus, because it was deemed not necessary to have it any higher. If it is a bit higher, it's not going to hurt. Don't worry if your fertiliser is 10-10-10, you're not going to kill your plants. It's just that an amount of the phosphorus is unlikely to be utilised. That's all it's sort of getting at. And then the potassium slightly higher than the nitrogen at 15%. Now this has got 8% calcium and 2% magnesium. And I've read quite a few articles where the ratio of calcium and magnesium to the NPK values needs to be somewhere, in the calcium's terminology anyway, is about half. You know, so if you've got, say, 15% nitrogen, then around 8% calcium won't do any harm. And the ratio of the magnesium to calcium should be about 4:1. Now, some plants will use more magnesium than others, and that ratio might not be high enough, and a little kick of magnesium might be necessary. You have to bear in mind, not all orchids feed the same. Some use more of certain elements than others, and really you're only going to find that out by trial and error. You won't, it's very difficult to find anything written down at that level of detail anyway. And then that's got all the trace elements in there as well, which I don't even bother looking at the percentage of those. I just know they need to be there. So that's my basic feed, and most of the time that's what the orchids get. How strong you feed your orchids is a matter of opinion, quite honestly. I wouldn't ever profess to tell anybody how strong their feed needs to be, but I very rarely go above 200 parts per million. And I wouldn't use a feed that high during the winter when not much is happening with the plants. There's no point in stonking fertiliser into your pots if the plants aren't growing much. Yeah, so think about the fertiliser you're using. If you've got plants chucking out new growths left, right and centre, they need feed. Yeah, so you can get your levels higher, or keep them lower and far more frequent. I still believe that a little and often does more good than loads of plain water for weeks on end and then chuck in a really high value. That doesn't sit well with me, I'm afraid. Can't really tell you why, but I just don't like the idea of that. It doesn't sit with me. Right, so that's the basic feed. That's what they get virtually all the time. Unless I'm flushing, of course, in which case they get plain water. Forget the container, that is actually CalMag. What actually happened was the screw top lid broke, and it basically wouldn't come undone. It would not unscrew no matter what I did, so I had to tear it off and then find a new container with a with an airtight lid. So that's my CalMag. That is calcium and magnesium with added iron and a small amount of nitrogen. So just because it's called CalMag, it's not just calcium and magnesium, but whatever's in there is readily absorbed. And if I think my plants need a little bit of a boost of calcium and magnesium, then they'll get the CalMag. But there are times when I don't want to put any more magnesium in there. And although I've hardly ever used it yet, what I have got is some liquid calcium. So that's calcium without anything else. It's just calcium on its own in a liquid form. I've used that very little so far. But that might be good to just, after a repot or something, to just give it a kick. I've also recently got, and not yet used and not yet even opened, some calcium nitrate. Now this is going to be good when we get into the heavy growing season. what I will probably be doing, not finalised yet, need to do a little bit more looking up, but the idea is I will have 2 lots of feed on the go. I'll have this one, my general purpose feed, and as I pick a pot up, I'll make a decision. Is this plant really growing strong and pushing on at a rate of knots? And then I'll have a separate feed which will have that in it and some of that added, because that is basically additional nitrogen and calcium to back it up. Yeah, if you put too much nitrogen in into your feed, you will get soft wishy-washy growth without the backup of the calcium and the support of the balance of the rest of the elements. So that's my stuff. The only other thing I've got is this stuff. This, strictly speaking, isn't a feed. You shouldn't really think of this as fertiliser. It's more what it says on the tin. It's a growth stimulant. The reason being it's got lots of things like hormones and things like that in there. You could more think of that as instructions to grow, not things to grow with. This is all the stuff that things grow with. This is more like a set of instructions. The hormones tell the plant to get on and do stuff, or give it the ability to make those decisions. Probably a better way of looking at it. So that, that's just a kelp-based seaweed stuff. It's got trace elements, but it's the hormones and things that make that useful. It's a stimulant, basically, as it says on the tin. Oh, now I've got down here, I can't get up. Ow. So that's my stuff and the reasons it could be used. That should not be used that often, and it shouldn't be used too strong. It's designed mainly for garden use, where it's going to go into the soil. Yeah. So I wouldn't add more than 25-30 parts per million of that into anything else, whether it was just into plain water or mixed in with the fertiliser. I keep that low, but boy does that play with my pH, that flipping stuff. For my low feeders, Masdevallias and stuff like that, the general purpose feed goes in at about 80 to 100 parts per million. General purpose feed for the rest of the stuff during the winter, 130, 140, and as we get into the growing season that will head up towards 200. The Vandas get about 200 in the winter and higher in the summer, up towards the 300 mark. They're heavy feeders, Vandas. The calcium CalMag, I used to add to that, but I'm not too happy with that principle as a general feed, on the grounds that it's putting extra magnesium in there as well as extra calcium and extra iron. So that added to that becomes extra. So I use that on its own. Yeah. And every now and again my plants get a feed of just that. And when I use just that, I put it in at about 50-60 parts per million. So it's a relatively low dose, because it's in addition to what the plant's already got in it from the last time I watered it. As I said, this stuff hasn't yet been used, but that will be added to this, probably about, again, only about 30-40 parts per million. Yeah, and it will boost the calcium and the nitrogen, and it will only get used for plants that are growing vigorously, that need the extra help. Because if they're not growing vigorously, that's fine on its own. It does the job. Since I started using that, my plants have done much better. Since I started using that, which is only last year, they seem to have done a bit better yet again. And certainly less instances of rotting or new growth dieback or anything. And I was told that's what would happen, and it did. I like that. Okay. And then that is used as a growth booster. It's a kick of nitrogen and the calcium to back it up. It will get used with that. That probably isn't going to get used very often now that I've got a flipping great container of it because that was the smallest one I could get. But that's basically calcium on its own. That could be used for poorly plants. Yeah, calcium on its own, get some in there, try and give them a bit of strength, you know, that sort of thing. It could also get used with this just to up the calcium in a single feed. Yeah, that would be calcium and nitrogen. That would be calcium and magnesium, tiny bit of nitrogen and some iron. So that's the logic. Those are additives, they're not feed. That's not feed, that's a growth booster, stimulant, hormones. That's feed. And when you're playing with all that, your pH will fly around all over the place, pH down, pH up. So that you know what you're doing, TDS meter. That doesn't tell you what's in your water, it tells you how much of stuff is in there. That can give you not a clue as to what's in the water. And some things can go in your water and not even register. And I've always said that if you add up the percentages there, you've got 13, 15, 3, 8, 2 and some other stuff. It doesn't come to 100%. I think it comes to about 40 something, but I'm not doing maths at this time of day. I haven't had enough coffee. Yeah? So the rest of what's in there is not feed. It's things like buffers and ballast and all sorts of things like that. What does that do to the pH? Unknown. Totally unknown. So all you can do is get a rough reading of how strong stuff is. And then that little beauty will tell you how acidic or alkaline your water is. Once you've added that, you might want to check your water now and again to see what it's like, especially rainwater, because it can vary. Mine doesn't, it's RO water, it comes out at a pH of 7, and it doesn't change. But yeah, once you start playing with these things, your pH will rocket up or down depending on what you're doing. And you need to bring it back to a place that you're happy with. I mean, the recommended pH is somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5. Well, I'm happy in some instances to use a pH higher than 6.5, especially in my pots with organic media, because the media is going to have an effect on the pH and gently lower it while the pot stays wet. Yeah, and the feed and everything that went in is still available, the roots are still taking it on as they need it, but the pH is dropping naturally in the pot. I won't personally ever go lower than 5.8. I'm sure some terrestrials wouldn't be so bad off with that sort of thing, but I'm not sure that our epiphytes would ever get water run off down the trees and things like that that's got an incredibly low pH. Because don't forget, the water our epiphytes get is nothing more than rainwater running down the trees. And sometimes it runs down the trees, and by the time it gets to the ground, it's hardly changed at all. Yeah, especially in heavy rain seasons, because the last time it rained, it washed the good stuff down. The next time it rains, there's not so much to wash down. The next time it rains, there's not so much to wash down. Yeah? So, you know, they're very rarely getting any form of strong feed in the wild because the rain washes it down and they grab hold of some as it goes past. It's a basic principle. But things that grow in the ground or in leaf litter, that's a different ball game. I haven't got any of them. Well, I have, but I'm not talking about those now. So that's my stuff. And in some cases, what I have used it for, and in some cases, what I will be using it for because I haven't had it long. I only got this stuff a couple of months ago, and I've only used it a couple of times so far. And that will not get used more than about once every 3 weeks, maybe once a month this time of year. It's not going to get used frequently. It's a booster. But I don't want that building up in the plants because it can cause distortions. You know, I've seen overdosing on the kelp stuff actually producing distorted flower spikes and blooms that come out all wrong, twisted, you know, with petals missing and things. So it can cause some overreaction within the plant. so I don't go mad. And when that gets used, it won't ever go above 30 parts per million. For me, that's what I've decided to do. Right or wrong, that's what's happening. And as I say, these three, that's probably not going to get used much at all. CalMag goes in on a regular basis, but as a standalone feed. Yeah? And then the calcium nitrate is brand shiny new. Haven't used it yet, but it will be used for vigorously growing plants to top up the elements in there. The nitrogen and the calcium. Nitrogen on its own don't do so much good because it can produce floppy growth or extended growth. It hasn't got the strength in it, but put the calcium in there as well, and it has. So that's my stuff. That's what I use. And the basis of all that is being added to RO water. So I'm starting with a blank canvas, you could say. I've got a pH of 7 and parts per million is about 9 or 10. And so negligible. and that's how it will be, because I only use the RO water. There are no variables until my membranes or filters start breaking down in the unit, at which point my base water will change. Yeah, so that's how I keep my eye on the actual RO unit. So that's the stuff I use and what I use it for, and in my mind, why. Yeah, not just do, but question. I won't just do. I have to know why I'm doing stuff. And well, you know where a lot of the explanations of to what this stuff does and how well it works have come from. You know as well as I do. But I have done my own work as well. And I'm happy to follow, but I still like to know why, you know. Never been any good at following orders. Except for there's a car coming, get out the way. I'll follow that order, you know. But you know what I mean. Anyway, that's my stuff and a chat about it. And I'm sure some people glazed over or are bored stiff. But I get asked a lot about what I use and how much and all that sort of stuff. So that's just like a little benchmark of what's on the go at the moment. Come back this time next year, it might be different. I might have changed my mind. I might have found that some things are working better than others. Some things don't seem to have much effect at all. So why waste your money? You know, all that sort of thing. So I do adjust. Once upon a time, I think the first year I got this stuff, that's all I used. That's all I used. So these have come along since. This was recommended. Get some of that into your plants. Stimulate that growth into action. And then use this stuff to make it work. Yeah? Instructions. Action. That sort of thing anyway. Okay, see you next time. Thanks for dropping by. I'm sure that's going to generate a shed load of questions. That's all I need. But feel free, and don't guarantee that I can answer them. I get questions sometimes that I really don't know the answer. And that's the answer you'll get from me. Sorry, I don't know. But I'm sure you can look it up somewhere. Yeah, I don't know everything about all this stuff. But I've learnt a hell of a lot, bit at a time, not all at once. Instant headache all at once, so bit at a time. Add a little bit of knowledge in as you go along, like a top up. And that way it goes in easier and it's more likely to stay. Right, see you next time. Bye for now.